Hey everyone, how's it going? So you might have seen at the end of last year, GT announced that they're stopping production of their bikes and they'll sell off the current stock and things and see how things go. So it doesn't look like GT is going to be around for too much longer. I've had this bike for a while and I've always wanted to build it up as a really cool commuter bike. So I got my mate Darcy to weld on some disc brake mounts. It helps the bike act a bit more predictable in the rain and stuff. We have rain kind of on and off year round, but certainly coming into winter we've got a lot more of it. So we'll have some fenders on the bike and yeah, it'll be a pretty cool commuter bike. So this is a tangency tubed GT. This is a 1989 GT Avalanche, which is quite a high level bike. It's got some dual boulder cage bosses on the down tube. They're really cool old GT font on the back of the top tube. This does have factory U brakes, so U brakes on the seat stays, which kind of suck. It's got internal cable routing in the top tube as well for the rear brake. Really cool bike. This colorway is the Arctic Snowstorm, which is really unique and pretty well sought after bike actually. This is a 22-inch one as well, so really good size for me. So first of all, you can see there's some rust spots and stuff. It's not really too bad, but we're going to tidy it up a little bit. Got to take out the bottom bracket first. I think when I got this bike, I got this from my mate Zane. Thanks heaps Zane. His dad used to ride this, which is really cool. I think when I first got it that I made sure the bottom bracket wasn't stuck. I tend to do that, and then like if it is stuck, I'll soak some stuff in there and then let it sit for a while. But yeah, came out okay. On drive side, these are pretty good to get off. Like I haven't really had any of these stuck, at least in a while anyway. Once I got the bottom bracket out, we could see a bit of corrosion and stuff in the bottom bracket shell. It's kind of hard to tell here, but I don't know if this is like just rusty grease or if it's actual rust underneath there. But luckily the bottom bracket shell was painted, so no rust through there. The disc brake mount, it's got some rust on it. I can't remember if Darcy clear coated it, but anyway, we need to get that off and then we'll paint over it. I do have the factory stem for this as well. I decided not to go for it with this build, but it has a really cool GT font on it as well, which is pretty cool. So we'll go over and clear coat some of the things. I was hoping to have a paint that would sort of match so we can cover up the disc brake mount. I take out the fork and then go about tidying up the frame. Headset's in really good condition. And the stereo tube looks good and everything. No damaged threads or nothing. Still has some grease in it, which is always good to see. So the chips and the rust and stuff we're going to clean up and then use some rust converter on. So this is just a fine synthetic wool that just gets rid of like some of the rust staining and stuff. The paint has seen better days, so it's not really going to do too much damage to it by going over with this. You can just polish it if it was like a little bit less than this, but because some of the bits have gone through and down to bare steel, I thought we're going to have to touch this frame up anyway, so bit of fine synthetic wool, it's not going to hurt too much. Just using a bit of WD-40 as lubricant. And as you can see, it doesn't really damage the paint, just sort of strips off some of the rust and stuff. This part on the chainstay here, where the chain is, I'm guessing it's sucked in between the chain ring and stuff. It's damaged pretty bad, so I used some 400 grit sandpaper instead of the fine synthetic wool. After that, we give it a bit of white down, and then this is the rust converter that we're going to use. This basically neutralizes it and turns it to like a primerable or paintable material. First we're going to clean it off with some isopropyl alcohol. This just gets rid of any of the little grease and WD-40 that we've used to clean the bike. Then a quick little soapy water wipe down. And that's it before we rust convert it. So there's going to be a few patches that are rust converted, and the rust converter paints on white but it turns the rust black. So this will only affect rusted steel, so it doesn't matter if you get any on the paint, it's not going to damage the paint at all. And because there's quite a few little patches that will be converted into black, I decided to touch it up. Because the Arctic snowstorm is kind of like a mixed match of colours. It's got some grey in it, and it's all sort of like splotched around. I thought I could just sort of touch it up a bit and it wouldn't look too out of place, because the rust converted black dots kind of stand out quite a bit. Unfortunately, I didn't have any blue that would sort of match it, so the best thing I had was some of the silver paint. As you can see, from a step or two back, it doesn't look too bad. Just looks like it's got some extra grey in it. The disc brake mount, I couldn't find any blue, so for the time being, it's just going to have some purple on it. I don't really like how much grey there is here, but it doesn't actually look too bad on camera, because it's the front camera and the screen is busted. But so there were quite a few patches that ended up grey. So some of it's, like on the chainstay there, was a bit too much. But going over to building the wheels now, I had a Hope rear hub and this Dynamo front hub for the build. So I've ordered some spokes. These are just DT Swiss Champion spokes and brass nipples. That's the rear hub. Just a little bit of damage to the free hub body, but that's pretty typical. Those alloy free hub bodies get eaten up by steel cassettes. And this is the front hub. So I've got a Russian Muller dynamo light for it. The rims, we've got these Alex DM24s. We've got quite a bit of oxidization on them, but I've tested one patch here that was just autosol, and then more over to the right here, I used some of that synthetic wool and then some autosol, and that looks a bit better. You can see my grubby fingerprints here, but that came out really good. So I just need to use some soapy water to get some of the disgusting contaminants off and years of filth and stuff. Then from there we'll go over with the synthetic wool WD-40 combo. That just smoothens it out and it sort of bites through some of that oxidization a bit better. Autocell by itself does a really good job. I thought it was going to be aggressive enough because Autosol does have quite a bit of grit in it, but I did a test patch and it didn't do as well as I'd hoped, so I could probably polish it up to a high level, like if I used sandpaper, just in increasing levels of grit, and then went through and polished with a couple of different compounds. But sort of speed, and for the fact that it's going to get quite a bit of abuse on it throughout the year, and the second I clean it, if I'm not careful, I'll put some scratches into it anyway. So I thought this way I can just repolish it if it sort of tarnishes a bit. That's a really good level for the ease of polishing and everything. And yeah, just going to be a commuter bike, so I don't have to go too crazy with it. But it came out looking really good. I used some Brasso. It's a little bit finer than Autosol. Doesn't have as much grit in it and stuff. And it gives a nice level of shine. There's 1,000 different products and everyone has their own sort of favorites, but Autosol and Brasso are the two that I tend to use. So building up the wheels now, I use grease. Everyone has their own different things that they put in the nipples. So some people use like a thread locker kind of thing, and like a what's it called? It's like spoke locker. I forget the name of it. Other people use linseed oil or something like that. Apparently linseed oil is really good because it doesn't fully set, so it's sort of like a lubricant and locker at the same time. So starting with the drive side of the rear hub, basically just put the spokes in and skip a hole. So I'm doing these from the inside out first, and it makes it a bit easier in the long run. So some people do this different ways. This is just the lacing method that I use and I know. So there's a couple of different things to watch out for, but I'll just go over like a quick couple of little things. So the rims are normally drilled offset, so you want to select the nipple hole that's on the same side as what you're lacing. You might need one of these as well, depending on how deep your rim is, if you've got a double wall rim. Don't always need it though, especially starting off. You can just sort of push the whole spoke up through. I normally thread these on about 2 turns to start with, just to get them started. Then your second spoke will be, you skip 3 holes and then go into the 4th one. So this is a 32 hole and I'm doing 3 cross pattern. Pretty typical really for most wheel builds really. So after the first 8 spokes are in, before you put in the next 8 spokes on the same side, you want to check the rotation of the hub. So you'll need to turn it away from the valve hole. And then once you've got the spokes in, you'll be sort of aiming for the middle hole. So these will all be on the same side that you've been lacing, so the right side for me, because the holes in the rim are offset. And because this is a 3 cross wheel, we're leading the spoke under 2 others and then over the last one that's leading up towards its corresponding hole. This is a screwdriver modified to sort of sit into nipples a bit better. It has like a little nub in it to lead into it. That's it after the 16 on the drive side. Then we're kind of doing the opposite. Sounds pretty cool. It's got a bit of a wobble to it because there's no tension on it, obviously. So from there, lacing the non-drive side, you can see here which spokes I do first. It works out easier. So you do from outside in first and then inside out. Certainly lacing the non-drive side, once you've done the drive side, it's a bit easier. Just the same as lacing the second wheel, it's a bit easier than the first one of the day. So here I've got this modified screwdriver. It just has like a little bit of a nub in it. Can't remember if I mentioned that earlier, but it works out good. I don't have like a specific driver for it. We've got the driver at work, and I think just using a normal screwdriver is easier for me. I guess technically it's faster using the driver, like the Park Tool nipple driver, but it's not as easy to use because it just rotates. So yeah. So I do all the nipples down pretty much to the bottom of the threads, and then I'll go around and do like 1 full rotation until it gets a bit closer to the tension that I need. You want to keep relieving tension as you go though. Like after each full rotation, I will relieve tension on it. You can do this by hand or by standing on it or just twisting it and stuff, but just keep going until you've got a bit of tension in it and then take out any wobbles, but normally works out pretty good. This is the front wheel as well. Has a tiny little bit of a wobble to it, but we'll get that out once we've got the tyres on. You will have to check tension once it's been loaded up with tyres as well, because they sort of add an inward tension on the wheel. So I try and get it like 90% of the way, and then once the tyres on, finish it off. Checking out the dynamo. It's working good with the hub, so it's a good sign. Didn't waste my time with the light and everything, so that's pretty cool. This headset looks so cool. It's got its own little writing on the inside as well, which is nice. Cleaning up the bearings. We'll check those out, make sure there's no rust on them or anything. They did have some grease on them, so they should be okay, but you never really know until you clean them off. There's a couple little marks here, but just checking, and that is just some grease, which is always good. So we'll clean those off fully and then re-grease them and put them back in the bike. Look really good, nice and clean. Before we put the headset in though, we're going to throw some penetrol inside the frame, because the steer tube would block off some of the holes and stuff. So you can see there's holes inside the bottom bracket shell and inside the head tube there. So this is just like a the gear cable sort of sheathing. It gets down in the frame really well. Some people use frame saver. There's so many different types of rust prevention. I like this because it's quite oily, so it spreads around inside the frame really well. You can see here, this is the head tube. So you can see, then you just sort of shake it around and everything. Just greasing up the headset now. I just use like a waterproof grease from the auto store. This is just from Supercheap Auto. Works really well. It's like a waterproof wheel bearing grease. Feels really similar to the Park Tool one, but it's a fraction of the cost, so. Putting up the fork now. And starting to thread on that top nut. I wipe off the grease and put that in the stereo tube because with the quill stem you need grease in there, otherwise everything's going to seize all up and everything and not be the right torque. Death to the nubs. I hate these nubs. You can use them if you want, but I've seen them gack up so many stereo tubes that I just file them off now. This is a really cool locking nut. It's got rubber seals in a couple of places, which is pretty nice, so it'll prevent water from dripping down the stem and into the headset. Really cool. I'll put a little bit more grease in the stereo tube and then onto the stem as well. So we're using a quill converter and a little bull moose handlebar. I use that toothbrush to make sure that the grease gets down in there. Same as the C-tube as well. I think I got this quill converter used, so I don't know the exact one, but it looks really cool. It's got like a nice square edge so it doesn't look too goofy. I do also have the threaded knitted bull moose handlebar, but I'm using that on another bike, so don't come at me in the comments for using a quill converter. I just didn't want to have to buy another handlebar. They're pretty expensive, but really cool. The shifter we're going to be using on the bike is this Dior. This is an MT60. So this is actually what would have been on the bike from factory. I had a couple of the parts from it. DX red derailleur, and yeah, Dior MT60 cranks. Just going to clean up the mount for it. Make sure the inside of the shifter is looking okay. They're super reliable, but every now and then I'll find one with like a little bit of rust inside it, so I'll hit it with like a little bit of oil. So the mount had some rust on it. I'm just going to hit it with the wire brush. Then use a bit of isopropyl alcohol to wipe off any of the little debris and stuff. Then it's all ready for paint. We're just going to hit it with some edge primer. I don't know why I'm saying hit it a lot. And some matte black spray paint. So it goes on glossy, but it dries up to a nice matte finish. So pulling these apart, there is one tiny little Phillips inside that hole there that you can't see. Just trust me, it's in there. It's in there. And that removes the top cap. So don't just try and pry it off without taking that screw out, because you'll break it off. So sometimes I've found some rust in here. I think this is spring steel on the top here. We're not going to pull it apart. You can go back to my Kona Lava Dome video, the green bike, where I completely pull apart one of these shifters to modify it a bit. Pretty simple really, there's just like a couple little bearings to change from index to friction. Pretty simple. Don't really need any maintenance. This should really be dry, but a little bit of oil prevents them from rusting, so I used a couple drops of oil in them. And that's that all back together. Feeling nice and smooth. So I didn't really know which brake lever I was going to use on the bike. I had these die-cut ones as well as the Shimano MT60 or MT62 brake lever. These die-cut ones have a bit of play from factory and they don't have a barrel adjuster. I didn't know how that was going to work with the cable brakes. But I have these Odyssey monolevers, as well as on the On One. I got a couple of sets when they were on special. These are the trigger lever, so really cool shape to them. So as it turns out, these brake levers work really well with thummies. Nice bit of clearance there, and it sort of overlaps like a little bit, which is really cool. heaps of clearance as well, so I can have them in a few different positions and it's not going to foul on the brake lever. Every now and then you'll run into a brake lever that just doesn't bode well with dummies, unfortunately. I'm going to use ESA chunky grips on the bike. I have a bunch of these sitting around as well. I really like these grips, so you just use some isopropyl alcohol, shove that inside the grip and then drip it onto the bar. And from there check it, make sure that the width is the same. I leave like a little bit of overhang here. It sort of evens out the bar end. So you really don't want these to go on twisted. They lock on really well, but about the only downside is you can tear them. It's not too easy to tear them, but I have had a couple tear. One was from a car and the other one I dropped it. So like the bar end sort of tore a little bit. Not too bad though. Brakes we're using are the same that we used on the On1. So these are Avid BB7 Road calipers. Tyres we're using are Maxxis DTH. So these are 2.15. Look really cool on the polished rims. Could have used like a crazier, sort of more exclusive tyre, but these work well for commuting in my experience. Like I'll go like 3 months or something without a puncture, and then for some reason I'll get 2 or 3 punches in a row. Then I'll go for like another 3 months without a puncture. I tend to run some sealant inside my tubes. Yeah. The cranks we're using are these really old Walter USA cranks. They've got a 94 BCD bolt-on spider. Don't know what width bottom bracket we're going to need to make the cranks work, so we're just going to throw this UN72 in there and see what happens. This is pretty short though, so I'm not too optimistic about it, but fingers crossed, because the UN72s, they last a really long time. They're really nice bottom bracket. I would say not like Dura Ace level, but quite robust. Very lovely. So throwing that in with a bunch of grease to make sure it doesn't get stuck in there, and it prevents rust and everything building up in the bottom bracket shell. And the excess that we're wiping from here going onto the seat post. Then like a little bit on the taper, but we don't want a huge clump on there. And just doing up the non-dry side that's adjustable here before trying on the crank arm. And I heard it as I put it on, but it's just smashed into the cup. I don't know why I didn't notice this when I tried it outside of the bike, but yeah, not too great. So we tried a different, wider bottom bracket. I think it was about 120 millimeters. And then we're trialing the chainring to see if it can sit on the inside or the outside of the crank arm. Before we bolt the crank arm on properly, you're going to check these bolts, make sure that they're in there properly, not going to strip themselves out or whatever. And tightening up the crank arm before we put the chainring on. So it does suck in a bit there, but we've got plenty of clearance for the chainring. Just putting the bolts in now. I think if I did have a bottom bracket sort of in between those two widths, it would have been better. It would sort of bring the chain line in a bit. It's a little bit far out, but it's not too bad. I thought I'd rather go this route than having it too intensely close to the chainstay there. So this is a 40 tooth chainring. I normally use a 36 or 38 on my commuter bikes. I think 38 is a pretty good middle ground for the terrain, like the cycle lanes and stuff that I use. I sort of tend to spin out sometimes on like slight downhills or aggressive downhills, so I thought I'd try the 40 tooth just in case I get a tailwind or something. Yeah, give me like a little bit extra gearing. I don't have the right cassette at the moment. This is an 8-speed 11 to 34, I think it was, but I want something a bit bigger. at least a 40 tooth, so then I have 1-to-1 gearing, but hopefully like a 42 or even a 46 would be really cool to put on it. We're using a Microshift Acolyte rear derailleur, which I know the pull ratio is different from Shimano, so we might have to sort of fiddle around with that to try and get the friction shifter to shift the whole thing. Friction shifters are kind of open to interpretation of what derailleur you use with it. Because there's so many different pull ratios and stuff, sometimes the friction shifter, it just doesn't pull enough cable to shift the whole thing. I quite like the Acolyte derailleur. The only downside is the cable exit angle is kind of aggressive. So I've seen them just tear through cable inners. But we're going to see how it goes in this application. There could have just been a really old derailleur that was sort of beaten up and did that, but I've seen it happen a couple times, so I'm not too optimistic about it long term, but we'll see. It's got a clutch, which is really cool, so something to keep the chain on while we're doing some curb drops and stuff, commuting. Throwing the gear cable through the thummy now, and then we're going to get that hooked up to the derailleur and see how far it pushes the derailleur across the cassette. I've made a SRAM 12-speed work with a friction shifter, so I'm hoping the Microshift isn't too far off that. So you can see there the cable angles pretty bad, but now we can see how far that friction shifter shifts the Acolyte. So it doesn't quite make it. You can mount the cable on the opposite side of the bolt, so it looks like we'll try that, and that should give us extra leverage, because at the moment we're shifting the lever the whole way around. So there are a couple little tricks that you can do to sort of increase the pulled, or the effective pulled cable. It's basically changing sort of the geometry at which the cable is pulled at. So by mounting it on the opposite side of the bolt, that in turn increases the lever. But because of the angle that this derailleur pulls at, it gets to a point and it just stops pulling. So it shifts it like a little bit more, and it shifts it sort of across 80% of the derailleur faster, but it gets to a point where it's not really pulling the derailleur over. So we shifted it again to a different spot in the derailleur, and it worked a bit better, but we're still having to shift the shifter around really far. It shifts the friction to index nub sort of in between the two. I didn't have a tan pan, but I did have this. I think it's the tan pan, which is the gear inline leverage pull adjuster, right? And I checked that out, and that would pull a bit more cable, so it would work. But we tried this setup, and that ended up working. So it goes just into, you can see, just goes into like the adjustment knob. So that knob there, it changes the shifter from index to friction. We're going to use it all the time on friction anyway, so I don't need that knob. It's just I was hoping to get it sort of less into that knob, but before we modify the shifter, we're going to put the chain on, then see how it goes. So we cut the chain to length and put it back together. So I have modified the shifters before. I really don't mind doing it. I've got a few of these thummies, so I don't feel too bad about sort of chopping one up, but I'm trying to avoid it if I can. So I was hoping that the cable would pull without getting into that nub, but because it pushes it out of the friction mode and sort of in between friction and indexed, it ends up with like a chunky shifter feel. It's not quite indexed, but it's definitely not friction. So it's kind of like in between the two, you can see there. So unfortunately we're going to have to get rid of that nub, which means we've got to take the shifter back off and pull it apart, and then we'll shut that knob off. You can do it with the shifter still attached and everything, but I wanted to do a bit of a better job. Then we can sort of file it down a little bit and clean it out to make sure we don't have any metal filings in the shifter as we go to use it. So just taking out that screw, you can see it now, you can see the tiny little screw that holds that top cap on. So that nub is attached to a plate that basically adjusts sort of where the positioning of a couple of ball bearings are underneath here. So probably the easiest thing to do is just to cut that nub off. You could probably replace it with an equal washer, but it kind of requires a whole lot of faffing about because that plate sort of keeps the ball bearings in location, and if you replace that, you would, like, the ball bearings wouldn't go in the same spot, and then the whole shifter would be out of whack. It requires like its own friction, obviously. So to avoid sort of the stack and everything of the shifter, just cut that nub off. Just makes it a whole lot simpler. And once we cut that off, it's no longer sort of shifting out of friction. So you can see the shifter goes all the way around, and that allows us, apparently you can shift a SRAM Eagle 12-speed with these, according to my previous adventures. But yeah, pretty cool, really versatile shifters. So in the future, I kind of want to try the Shimano Q's derailleur and cassette. But for now, we're just going to rock this setup with an 8-speed cassette. So the rear brake cable, as you can see, it's routed through the frame. I don't know if that's just a tube that goes from the inlet to the exit. So we're just going to tape up the old inner cable to the new one and sort of feed it through. So we're just pushing and pulling at the same time, making sure that that little bit of tape is holding it together enough. So this frame is sort of sorted in a way that you need outer cable going into the frame, and it stops most of the way down the top tube. So once we've got the inner tube out, pretty cool. So I've already cut that outer cable to length, but I forgot to put the ferrule on the cable stop onto the outer cable. So we've got to feed it all back through and everything. So it was kind of nerve-wracking doing it the second time because I knew that inside the frame there wasn't that pipe. Because when I put the cable in, it just opened up into like this big cavity in the top tube. So thanks, Zane, for leaving that cable in there, because we didn't know if there was a pipe in there or what. If we left this last section of cable inner exposed, it'd end up rubbing on the inside of the caliper as it goes inside, because it's not a direct line. So we'll need some kind of cable outer. For that we need a cable stop. We've got a couple little places here that we can mount something. I thought it would be cool to use the U-rake mount, but because it's round, it would just keep rotating. But because there's a couple of tubes up here, we can sort of make like a bracket or something. I decided to bolt it down and see, but it actually holds itself there. We're just going to have some spaces on the inside of that. This is just a down tube shift cable boss, and it ended up working really well. That's it all mounted up and everything with the cable outer and everything. Put like a little bit of grease here to sort of ease that bend. I have no idea how that worked out, but we've also got a little quick adjust as well. Not that we need it because we've got it at the lever, but pretty cool to have. And that's rock solid, so I couldn't have it down parallel to the seat stays, but that's okay. It's not really causing any issues, and that's a way less aggressive input angle than the derailleur with that craziness. The routing actually went pretty well too, so we don't have to have any ties to keep it away from the fender. Quite nice. So we got that all buttoned up. It just barely clears the seat tube, which is really cool, and it's really nice, smooth. lever feel, which is really good. I didn't know how the angles and everything would work out with it coming out of that internal routing part, but it works really good. Just got a few little tweaks to do on the brakes and the fenders, and then we'll throw the basket on. I don't know if you've worked with these Avid BB7s before, but they've got a couple of adjustments and stuff, but not too bad to set up. Basket we're using on the bike is the Wald 139. These are a bit bigger than the more common 137, but they work really well for commuting and stuff. You can fit groceries and stuff in. Just got a temporary mount set up at the moment. I'll probably put in like some extra little mounts from the brake bosses to the rack uprights. The light that we've got is this Bush & Mueller IQX, which apparently flashes quite a bit at low speed, but it should work good for us. And it was the best price of, it came on a $20 Avanti that I bought for the internal gear hub, so that was like a nice little bonus piece. And that's the bike all pretty well done. We got a couple little bonus parts as well. This is a Blue Lug Coma rear light, cool little part, and a couple of extra little purple bits, and then Blue Lug's purple bell as well, which looks really cool. A couple little bits and pieces. Still got to polish up the rims like properly to get rid of my fingerprint marks. Also got one of my reflectors from Neko Cycles. They're really cool. The purple and blue looks awesome on it. And a charged spoon saddle, which Craig from Second Life Bikes is really going to like. Also, because the bike has two down tube bottle cage mounts, I've got two anodized blue bottle cages. My 1 litre bottle actually fits in the top one like perfectly, and it's a really good place to reach it, so it's not further down the down tube, which is really cool. That's the bike all done. I'll talk about it like later in the video. Got a couple little tweaks like the cassette change and some things that I need to do, but yeah, enjoy. I'll see you at the end. Shit out of that line. So stupid. pretty much all for today's video. If you haven't rode one of these old GTs, specifically like the 80s and 90s steel ones, they're amazing bikes. The alloy ones ride great too. They're a bit harsher, a bit stiffer and faster, but if you run wide tyres, they can still be comfy commuters and everything. They're quite a nimble bike, but even so, they're still super stable at high speeds. Even with the front load on this bike, I can still no-hands it and it just tracks dead straight. It's really cool. Really love this setup with the ESI grips and everything. Nice and comfortable for me. So I've got another cassette coming. It's an 11-46, so that'll change the gearing up a bit. So there were just some hills where I felt like that 34 tooth out the back with the 40 tooth chainring wasn't low enough. But I didn't want to lose the top speed, so went for a bigger cassette. And that Acolyte, I think it does up to a 46. But at some point I want to change to the Q's system, and then we can try that out and see how that goes with friction shifter, because I know that's a different pull ratio as well. So it's good. It might take like the wolf tooth tan pan at the back. I don't know, I haven't really messed around with the Q's like friction shifted yet, so we'll see how that goes. Bike's just so cool looking. I love the setup with the purple and the blue and everything. After I filmed those clips of riding it and everything, I went back and cleaned my disgusting fingerprints off the rims. So they cleaned up really nicely. Look really cool in the sun. Not really anything else I want to do to the bike. I might put some extra struts on the rack. That rear hub sounds so cool. I did put some grease in there, so I thought that would quieten it down a bit, but it didn't. You don't want to use anything too sticky, but there's a couple sort of light greases that you can use. The bike suits the collection really well, especially up against the pink, the pink Specialized. We've got quite a few cool bikes now. And Cheeky Alien and the Rock Combo, amongst a few of the other more colourful ones. The next bike I'll be working on is this old Mongoose ATB. This is a mid-80s, ATB chrome frame, and it's got this cool biplane fork on it, which looks really sweet. So check that out. That'll be coming up in the next couple of weeks, I'd say. But for now, thanks. Hope you enjoyed the video, and chuck some comments down below if you want to know some more about it, and I'll see you soon. Bye.